We are encouraged to eat natural food, to live a more natural lifestyle, and as much as possible to use natural remedies for our health issues. It makes sense because the word natural comes from nature, and nature is good. Or is it? There is a concept in biology that includes the adjective natural, and that some people consider a good thing, but I disagree. I'm talking about natural selection. Charles Darwin is known for being the father of the theory of evolution. The full title of his most famous book is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favorite Races in the Struggle for Life. In it, Charles Darwin attributes to natural selection the ability to create all the biological diversity that we know, the entire array of animals and plants from one or a few very simple organisms. In the last paragraph of the book, Darwin says that there is greatness in this conception of life. For him, natural selection, it is a good thing. And yet, if we look at the end of the title, we realize that not everything is so nice. There is a struggle for life, and there are favored races, which implies that there are also disfavored races. Natural selection is about the survival of the fittest, or, in other words, the death of the least fit. Natural selection is associated with competition, scarcity of resources, and destruction of the weak. We have all seen it in documentaries on the African savanna. Natural selection is the reason why the smallest zebra in the herd, the weak or the sick one, ends up becoming food. Natural selection in action can be depicted in scenes like these of animals fighting fiercely for territory or for control over females. In other cases, the struggle is more subtle and uses tools such as beauty or camouflage, but the goal is one and the same: to survive and reproduce more than others, to pass on one's genes to the next generations by any means necessary, whatever the cost. This is precisely the main idea of Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. In this book, Dawkins describes a world governed by natural selection in which all organisms are driven by selfish motivations, with the sole aim of having more children than others. Dawkins takes the reasoning to the highest level by proposing that not only all organisms are selfish, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, and people, but also their genes are. According to Dawkins, genes are nothing more than selfish fragments of DNA whose primary purpose is to make many copies of themselves. Those genes would have clustered and organized themselves, inventing human beings and the rest of organisms as vehicles at their service to make those copies. Everything we are, not only physically but also our behavior, would be motivated by that single purpose: the intention of our genes to make as many copies of themselves as possible. If this way of thinking repulses you as much as it does me, you will be happy to know that nature is full of examples that contradict it. Many animals exhibit altruistic behaviors that do not benefit but harm them or put them in danger, but they perform them anyway to help others. Let's take a look at some examples. This bird is the Florida scrub jay. When the young females of this species reach sexual maturity, they do not leave the family nest but stay with their parents and help them raise the next year's chicks. Instead of living and forming their own family, these females give up having children for a few years to ensure that their brothers and sisters will thrive. Another well-known example are vampire bats. As their name indicates, these bats feed on blood, but they have a problem. Their energy consumption is so high that if they go 2 days without eating, they die. Scientists have discovered a clearly altruistic behavior in these bat colonies, consisting of sharing food. If a bat returns to the colony with an empty stomach, other bats that have been luckier share some of their food by regurgitating it into the mouth of their hungry companion. I know this is a bit disgusting, but it is surely altruistic. Besides, scientists who study these colonies have found that helping not only occurs between relatives, but also between unrelated bats. There are many other examples of altruism in the animal kingdom, but I wanted to start by explaining these two because Richard Dawkins and other evolutionary biologists have tried to use them to support their idea that selfishness runs the world. How can this be? For these people, these behaviors are not really altruistic, but selfishness in disguise. In the case of the birds, for example, the reasoning would be as follows. The young female who gives up starting her own family, it sacrifices nothing. Helping her brothers and sisters to survive is equivalent to having its own offspring, because siblings have the same genes. In addition, a young female with little experience who does not know how to take proper care of her chicks risks having them die after putting a lot of effort into them, so in reality, these females are selfish. Not only they get to multiply their genes anyway, they also practice and learn to be good mothers for when they finally decide to leave the nest. What about bats helping unrelated bats? The explanation for this case is that they are making allies to protect themselves in the future. A bat that feeds a partner, it doesn't do it out of altruism, but to make sure that when he doesn't find food, someone will help. People who see the world this way believe that true altruism does not exist even in humans. That people who spend time, money, and effort to help others, or even those who give their lives for others, actually have some hidden selfish motive. Personally, I find it very sad to look around and see nothing but strife, selfishness, and people, animals, and plants trying to trample on each other. Luckily, not all scientists have the same perspective, not even among evolutionary scientists. It is a matter of worldview. Each person's worldview is shaped by our fundamental principles and convictions, and it sets the way we see the world. It is like a pair of glasses that we put on every morning and that filter reality in a specific way. People who wear the natural selection glasses see selfishness everywhere. But as I said, that is not the case of the entire scientific community. In fact, there are some scientists who have a completely different perspective, and I would like to tell you about two of them. The first is botanist Suzanne Simard. Although most botanists study plants, Suzanne Simard studies fungi and how fungi relate to plants. I will briefly explain one of Dr. Simard's research projects that she herself explains in a very interesting TED Talk entitled How Trees Talk to Each Other. As I said, Suzanne studies fungi. When we hear the word fungi, we usually think of mushrooms. But mushrooms are only a very small part of fungi. They are just the reproductive organs located on the soil surface so they can spread the spores. But most of the body of a fungus is made up of very long filaments that extend through inside the soil. These filaments are called the mycelium. Suzanne Simard was studying the mycelium of fungi on a forest soil and noticed that the fungal filaments were connecting the roots of the trees together. She thought that maybe the trees could be using these filaments as an internet to communicate with each other. To test if her hypothesis was correct, Suzanne did what scientists do. she designed an experiment. She grew some small trees on the forest, and when they had grown a bit, she covered them with plastic to keep the environment of each one independent of the others and to be able to control what they were taking in from the air. You know that plants feed themselves using water, air, and sunlight through a process that we call photosynthesis. They take carbon dioxide from the air and use the carbon to make sugars and other molecules and build themselves. So the carbon that was in the air ends up forming part of the leaves, the trunks, and the roots of the plant. In this experiment, one of the trees was covered with a black cloth so that it could not access sunlight and could not photosynthesize. The plastic bags of the other trees, which were transparent plastic and allow them to photosynthesize, were injected with a radioactive carbon dioxide that could be detected with a Geiger counter. Different types of radioactive carbon were used, which are represented in the drawing with colors red and yellow. After a while, all the plants were tested with a Geiger counter, including the one that was covered. The result was very exciting because the plant that had been covered contained radioactive carbon. Since all the plants were isolated from each other in their aerial part, the conclusion of the study was that the plants that could photosynthesize had sent food to the plant that was covered through the fungus filaments connecting their roots. We can imagine the exchange of messages in the Internet of the forest as something like this. The plant covered in black sends a distress signal. Something's wrong, I can't see the sun and I'm hungry. And the other little plants respond by sending each sugars that they have made with the carbon dioxide that each one had at their disposal. Isn't that amazing? Trees not only communicate with each other, but also help each other. And some of the trees in the experiment were not even the same species. The second researcher I want to tell you about is the Dutch ethologist Frans de Waal. Frans de Waal studies animals that live in groups, especially primates. He has written several books, and one that I really like is The Age of Empathy. In this book, Frans de Waal explains that the social life of animals is not characterized by continuous struggle, but quite the opposite. Animals that live in groups collaborate with each other, avoid confrontations, and often show empathy and altruism. There is a quote in the book that I find very curious. It says, "The book of nature is like the Bible. Everyone reads in it what they want, from tolerance to intolerance and from altruism to greed." I don't know if Frans de Waal is a believer, but he is certainly an evolutionist. And yet, he looks at animals through different glasses than Richard Dawkins and sees very different things. Many of his experiments and observations have been done with chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are very intelligent animals and they are quite temperamental, so in chimpanzee societies it is easy for disagreements and conflicts to arise. Sometimes there are fights, but in most cases they try to solve problems peacefully. When a chimpanzee gets upset, his companions try to calm him down, and to achieve this, they use the same resources as humans do: kisses, hugs, and a gesture as universal as extending a hand. I want to share with you some of the experiments that Frans de Waal and some other researchers have carried out to study the social behavior of chimpanzees. In the first experiment, they were trying to find out if chimpanzees are willing to collaborate for a common goal. An elongated tray with food was placed outside the chimpanzee facility and a rope was placed around the tray. To get the food, the chimpanzee had to pull on both ends of the rope at the same time, but they were too far apart to reach. What the chimpanzee did was to open the door for his partner in the continuous facility, and they both collaborated by each pulling on one end of the rope until they got the food. What happens when a chimpanzee needs help and there is no other chimpanzee nearby? In the second experiment, food was placed under a heavy rock in view of a young chimpanzee. The chimpanzee tried to move the stone but did not have enough strength and there was no chimpanzee partner to help, so he went to the caretaker, took him by the hand and led him to the stone, asking him to help him lift it. These experiments showed that chimpanzees collaborate with each other and even with other species to get food, but this is not altruism. What happens in the opposite situation? What happens if a human needs help and there is a chimpanzee nearby? The following experiment has also been performed with small human children under 2 years old, with the same results. The researcher drops an object and stretches out her hand, pretending that she wants to reach it, but she can't. In a few seconds, the chimpanzee picks up the object and hands it over spontaneously, without asking for a reward. And children do the same. It is instinctive. In his book, The Age of Empathy, Franz Doval says the following, referring to both humans and chimpanzees. We are programmed to connect. Why would an evolutionist say that we are programmed? Surely he doesn't mean that, but to me, if there is a program, there is a programmer. The last experiment I'm going to explain is a bit more sophisticated. It was designed to find out whether chimpanzees consciously decide to help others if they have the opportunity. 2 chimpanzees were placed in adjacent facilities separated by a fence so they could see and hear each other. One of the chimpanzees was trained to hand over an object to the researchers in exchange for food, but could choose between objects of 2 colors. If he handed over the red object, the selfish choice, the researcher gave food to him only. But if he handed over the green object, the altruistic choice, food was given to both him and his partner. This graph shows the results of the experiment. The horizontal red line marks 50%. If the chimps were choosing randomly, the results should be around that line, but in most cases, they are above it. That means that they are preferentially choosing green. Each of the columns shows the outcome of the experiment under different circumstances. The first column shows cases when the chimpanzee in the facility next door was inactive. But chimpanzees are very smart. The second column represents cases when the partner had noticed that something was going on and he was calling for attention and asking for food. And the third column represents times when the partner became aggressive. It looks like actively asking for help increases the response, while aggressiveness generates a bit of a punishment, but in all 3 cases, the response is a preference for green. The last column is very important because it is the control of the experiment. It represents the cases in which there is no partner. This shows that chimpanzees know perfectly well what they are doing. They choose green when there is a partner, but when there is no partner, they mostly chose red. For me, all these experiments that show cooperation, empathy, and altruism in nature are strong evidences of how the world was in the beginning and how it should be. They are clues from the original creation that had not been erased even after thousands of years of sin. If we read the Bible starting from the beginning, we realize that in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, there is no natural selection. There is no scarcity of resources, no struggle for existence, no predation, no death. Animals and people feed on plants, and plants feed on water, air, and sunlight. Different organisms cooperate with each other and help each other in many ways. The Bible does not mention photosynthesis, but I'm pretty sure that God invented it and put it in plants, just like the process of respiration in animals and all other organisms. Respiration and photosynthesis are complementary processes, so that the waste product of plants is the gas needed by animals and vice versa. We have already said that plants feed animals, but the system is designed in such a way that by eating, animals help plants to reproduce because they transport their pollen and seeds. There are hundreds of examples of symbiosis in nature, and surely there were many more in the Garden of Eden. I like to call this original system of collaboration and altruism the circle of love. All organisms care about each other, and so everything works and nobody suffers. And that's the way things should have been forever. But if we keep reading, as soon as we get to chapter 3, we find the exact moment when natural selection entered our planet. When Adam and Eve decided to eat the forbidden fruit, they also decided to stop depending on God. Until then, God had been the provider of all their needs, but at that very moment, they thought that He did not deserve their trust, that He was hiding something important from them, and they wanted to get it at any price. In the following verses, we see how natural selection, with all that it entails, took hold of them. The circle of love was broken and turned into every man for himself. Mistrust, fear, and guilt appeared, making them hide, and self-defense made them attack each other and attack God. It's not my fault, it was the woman you gave me. It wasn't me, it was the serpent you created. Selfishness appeared and soon after spread to the rest of nature. Animals became selfish and began to eat each other. Plants produced thorns to defend themselves. Some even became carnivorous. In a few generations, the earth was so full with violence that God had to destroy it and start all over again. But in that new beginning, natural selection was already present, and it remains so to this day. We Christians love to find evidence of God's love in nature, but we have to recognize that competition and selfishness also abound. What should our attitude be in the face of this reality? Should we adapt, accept that natural selection is now the natural thing in the world, and play by its rules? There are Christians who think that natural selection is basically a good thing, that God invented it and used it to create through evolution. But the Bible is very clear. God created the world without competition, without suffering, and without death. And when we messed up, and Jesus had to come in person to show us what God is like, His attitude was totally anti-natural selection. Many times He gave specific instructions that oppose natural selection, such as love your enemies, bless those who curse you, pray for those who persecute you, turn the other cheek. If someone wants to take advantage of you, give them even more than they ask for. How difficult! It doesn't come naturally to us, and it doesn't seem to make much sense. But Jesus doesn't state it with His words alone. Jesus' actions place Him at the opposite extreme of natural selection. When the soldiers come to capture Him in the middle of the night, Peter, who is very much a man of natural selection, thrusts his sword and cuts off an ear. But Jesus rebukes him, because that is not His way of doing things. Jesus heals and forgives. Jesus humbles Himself and endures the most terrible tortures and even death at the hands of His enemies, having all the power in His own hands. That is the kind of God I believe in. The God of the weak, the sick, the children, the poor, the defenseless, of all the least fit who would be exterminated by natural selection. And that is why I cannot imagine him using natural selection, struggle, and death to create or to achieve his goals. The biblical story as it appears in Genesis seems much more consistent. God created a good world without suffering, without death, without natural selection. All those things appeared later because of human disobedience, and although all of creation has ended up paying the price for our rebellion, we can still find in nature numerous clues of how things were originally. Best of all, the Bible assures us that the course of natural selection is not forever. God is preparing our return to the original plan, and we know that on the new earth there will be no natural selection. Predators and prey will once again live in peace, and we will finally and forever enjoy a truly natural nature, the one that God had planned for us from the beginning. For what is truly natural are the empathy, love, and altruism that God programmed into our genes and our brains so well that even evolutionary scientists recognize the programming, even if they don't acknowledge the programmer. But we do know who our Creator is and what He is like, and we live in the blessed hope of seeing Him very soon and enjoying natural nature with Him in all its splendor and forever. See you there. God bless you.